Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for Web Design. Now that we've got our CSS file cleaned up and ready to go, we're going to work on positioning some of our elements. Right now we've got our images all scrunched up here at the top of the page, and we want to spread them out, move them over to the right, and then make our articles themselves a little bit narrower so that they don't overlap the images. Now, as we're doing this, we need to keep in mind that the text is going to be moving at a different rate of speed when we start scrolling than the icons or the images around it, or the images that they're associated with. So we can't just nudge the text down to the same position that the corresponding image goes with. We need to offset it a little bit so that when we scroll up to the point where we can see the text, it will be even with the image that it corresponds with. And what we're going to do is we're going to move the images up at half the speed of the text. So as the image comes up, we'll see the text suddenly jump up from underneath to catch up with it. And then once they get towards the top of the browser window, they're going to be even. And the way we're going to do this, again, is we're going to move the text twice as fast as we're moving the image that it corresponds with. So the text itself is actually going to be scrolled using the scroll bar, and it will scroll at the natural rate. So we don't need to touch the scrolling of the text itself in JavaScript. The images, on the other hand, they're going to be fixed, and they already are fixed to the top of the screen, but these images are all going to be fixed, and they're not going to scroll by default just by scrolling the scroll bar. We're going to have to create JavaScript for the images, just like we will for the background. So since the text is moving twice as fast as the images, what we need to do is we need to take, for example, the moon and its corresponding text, and we need to put the text for the moon twice as far down the page as the moon itself. And since the text is twice as far down and it's moving up twice as fast when we start scrolling, then by the time the moon gets towards the top of our screen, the text will have caught up with it and we'll have the right text next to the right image. So I don't know if that makes sense just yet, but as we work through it, we'll start to see how this is going to work. To boil it all down, since our text is moving twice as fast as the image, our text needs to be twice as far down the page in order for the scrolling to work properly. So let's jump into our CSS and start making this work. So the files we're working with now are the files that we ended up with in Lesson 10. So they're in the Lesson 10 end folder. And all the changes we make here are going to be saved in the Lesson 11 end folder. So we've cleaned up our CSS. And now we need to start positioning things. So let's start with our images. So we'll scroll up to the images section here. And remember, this images rule that we're targeting is a div with an ID of images. And this is the div that contains all of the images, including the moon, the rocket ship, and the illustration of Saturn. So now we need to go into each one of these individual images and position them where they need to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to position them all 1500 pixels above each other, basically. So the moon will be at a top position of 1500 pixels, and that will push it down the screen far enough so that even with a large monitor, that should push that moon all the way down past the bottom edge of the screen. So let's start with the moon image, which we gave an ID of img-moon. And inside that role, we're going to set its position to absolute. Remember that the position of the parent element, the images element, the position of that is fixed, and it's fixed to the very top. So all we're doing here is we're absolutely positioning the images within that element in order to push them down where we need them to be. So again, the moon image, we're going to set the position to absolute. We'll set the top value here to 1500 pixels. And again, what that does is it pushes the top of the moon image down 1500 pixels. And again, that should get it far enough off the stage so that we won't even see it, even if we're using a larger monitor. So the next thing we want to do is we want to nudge it over, because by default, this is going to show up on the left side of the screen, and we don't want it nudged up against the left edge like we see it right here. We want it to be halfway across the screen. And when I say halfway across, I don't want it to be centered on the screen. I don't want it to be right in the center, because then the text is going to overlap it. I want the left edge of the image to be pushed over 50% so that the left edge of the image will be right in the middle of the screen. So the way we do that is we simply say left, colon, and then 50%. And while I'm thinking about it, one more thing I want to do is, you'll notice in our browser that the stars come up to a certain point and then the rest of the browser area is blank. And I thought that I would like it that way, but I don't think I do. I think I want it to repeat. So we're going to go up here to the very top where the stars section is, and I'm just going to get rid of this no repeat rule because I don't like that as much as I thought I would. So let's save that and let's check it out. So we'll jump into our browser and refresh, and we notice two things. First of all, our stars are repeating now. Very good. That looks a lot better. And secondly, the moon is gone. The moon has moved down 1500 pixels, and we can't even scroll down to the moon because remember, the div that has the moon and the rocket ship and Saturn in it, that div is fixed to the very top of the browser window. So if an object is fixed, then it isn't affected by scrolling, which means that we can't scroll down to see any part of that div that appears below the bottom edge of the browser. We'll be able to scroll once we start moving our text down because that div is not fixed. But again, since the images div is fixed, we won't be able to scroll down to see that. But so far so good. Let's go ahead and jump back into our code and create rules for our other two images. So we have image-rocket. Again, we're going to absolutely position that one. So position : absolute. We'll set the top value here to 3000 pixels because that is 1500 pixels below the last one. And again, we'll set the left value to 50%. Now, if centering it at 50%, if centering the left edge of the image at 50% doesn't get it exactly where you want to, then you can also set a margin left to nudge it to the right or left a little bit. So if you give margin left a value of 20 pixels, for example, then it will nudge it over, first of all, it will nudge that left edge over 50% of the way across the screen. And then with a margin left of 20 pixels, it will nudge it over an extra 20 pixels. Or if you set margin left to negative 20 pixels, it will nudge it to the left of center by 20 pixels. So you can play around with it like that, and if it doesn't look perfect when the left edge is centered on the screen. So now that that's in place, we'll skip a couple lines and we'll do the same thing for Saturn. So image-Saturn, and these are all ID names that we already gave to the image tags themselves. And we're going to set the position of this one to absolute as well. We'll set the top value here, another 1500 pixels down. So we're going to set it to 4500 pixels. And again, set the left edge to 50%. So that should nudge all of our images off the stage. Let's save that, refresh our browser, and there we go. Now we have a little bit closer to what the home screen is going to look like, except that our home screen isn't going to have these three articles down here. It'll have the first article, the Welcome to Outer Space article, but the other three won't be on the screen. So let's go ahead and size those and position those accordingly as well. So we'll jump back into our CSS, and this time we're going to go down to our content section. And right now we just have a rule for the div that contains all of that content. The next thing I want to do is I want to specify the width of these articles, because these articles here aren't supposed to take up the entire width. We want them to take up the left half of that center area, and then the image will take up the right half of that center area. So we want to make these articles more narrow. So let's jump back into our code and make that happen. So right now, again, we're dealing with the entire content div, and now we need to create a rule for the articles within that content div. So we'll point to #content space article to point to any elements, again, within that content div. And we're going to give each of those articles a width of 350 pixels. So we'll save that, refresh our page, and we're sort of where we want to be. Not quite yet, because this top article needs to be the entire width of that area, that entire 960 pixels. So we need to specify for this top one that it needs to be wider. So we'll jump back into our code and let's take a look at our HTML. And if we scroll down, we can find this article with the Welcome to Outer Space header in it. And we see that this article doesn't have an ID in it. So there's two ways that we can handle this. We can either use the first child pseudo class in CSS, or we can just give this an ID, which is the easier way to do it. So we're going to set this article ID equal to home, because this is the article for the home page. I'm not going to set it equal to Earth because remember we gave the div that had the image of the Earth in it. We set that ID equal to Earth, and that's the ID that's going to take us to the very top of the page whenever we click on the appropriate button. So we're going to leave that one alone, and we'll give this article here an ID of home, since it is the article for the home page. So now we'll go back, we'll save that first of all, and then go back to our CSS, and we'll create another rule here. We'll point inside the content div, and we're going to point to an article that has a class of home. So article and then no space, pound home. So by not putting a space here, that tells us that we're looking for an article with an ID of home inside the content div. So what we're going to do for that article is we're going to set the width to 960 pixels. Save that, refresh our page, and there we go. So that gets us a little bit closer to where we need to go. Now we just need to finish positioning these three items, these three articles. So again, remember, since our text is moving twice as fast as the images that they correspond with, then what we need to do is we need to move each piece of text down twice as far as we've moved the image itself. However, there's something we need to keep in mind here. Keep in mind that the images themselves are inside a div with a position of fixed and a top position of 0. So when we set these items to, for example, a top position of 1500 pixels, it's putting it at 1500 pixels from the very top of the screen. However, it's a little bit different for our content area. Remember, we don't want our content area to be fixed because we want it to scroll naturally with the scroll bars, and if we fix it, it won't do that. So we need to keep our position at relative, which means that if we move something down here to a top position of 1500, it's not going to be 1500 pixels from the top of the browser, it's going to be 1500 pixels from the top of that content area. So we need to make sure that we plan for that and we subtract however much space is going to be above it. And what I mean by that, if we jump into our browser and take a look at this, right now, for example, if for some reason I wanted to move this welcome to outer space text 1500 pixels from the top of the browser, we couldn't just set it to a top position of 1500 because it's a relatively positioned item, which means it will move it 1500 pixels down from where it is right now. And that doesn't take into account all of the area that's taken up by the nav bar and the image of the Earth down here. Well, one quick way we can find out the height of everything that's above that area is we can right-click using Chrome here. We can right-click and then click on Inspect Element, and then Chrome has some really, really powerful tools for allowing us to do this. And you'll notice that if we hover over this div with an ID of Earth down here towards the bottom, then we can see a little tooltip that pops up in our browser window that gives us the dimensions of that section of the page, and we see that it's 225 pixels tall. So when we move one of these items down 1500 pixels from the top of this content area, we know now that that content area is 225 pixels down from the very top of the browser. So if we wanted to move this Fly Me to the Moon text down 3000 pixels from the top of the browser, we would take that 3000 pixels and then subtract however much space this top area takes up. So we would subtract 225 pixels. So instead of moving this down to an X position of 3000, we would move it down to 2775, which when you add that to this top area here, which has a height of 225, will give us a total height or a total distance from the top of the browser of 3000. And that's what we want. We want it to be twice as far down as the moon image that it corresponds with. And the moon image again is 1500 pixels down. So again, we just take 3000, which is 1500 times 2, and then subtract 225 from it. So let's jump back into our code and make that happen. So we're going to go down to the end of our content section here. We'll skip a couple lines, and now we're going to point to the article that has an ID of moon. Now for this moon item, we're going to set the position to absolute. And by setting it to absolute, that doesn't mean that it's going to be absolutely positioned from the very top of the browser. Remember, this is inside a div here that has a position of relative. And when you put a position of absolute inside an item with a position of relative, then that absolute position is actually relative to the parent container. So if we put a top value here and set that equal to 2,775 pixels, that will put it at a top position of 2775 pixels from the top of the content area, not the top of the browser itself. So by adding this 2775 again to that 225 pixels that the top nav and earth area take up, then we get a total of 3,000 pixels, which is exactly twice as far down the browser window as the image. So I hope that made sense. Kind of repeated myself a few times there, but I hope I got the point across. So our next section is the rocket section. So pound rocket, and then inside that section, now remember our rocket image is 3,000 pixels down from the top of the browser window. So we want the rocket text to be twice as far down. We want it to be 6,000 pixels down from the top of the browser window. So we're going to again set position to absolute. And we want it at a top position of 6,000. But remember, we've got that extra 225 pixels of spacing to deal with at the top. So instead of 6,000, we're going to set it to 5,775. And when you add that again to the height of the Earth and navigation section at the top, that equals 6,000, which is twice as far down as the rocket image itself. Okay, so our last item is the div with a class, or the article with a class of Saturn. So I'm sorry, an ID of Saturn. So we'll say pound Saturn. And again, we're going to set the position to absolute. And for this one, remember the Saturn image is 4,500 pixels from the top of the browser. So we want this to be 9,000 pixels from the top of the browser. And when we again subtract that 225 pixels from that, we get 8,775. So now each of our articles are positioned exactly twice as far down as the image that they correspond with. So once we jump into our jQuery and start coding this, by the time our moon, for example, gets to the top of the browser window, our moon text will catch up with it and they'll show up right next to each other at the top of the browser window. So eventually we'll need to add a little more CSS, but I don't want to do that just yet until you see some of the problems we're going to come across. So let's go ahead and save this, jump into our file or our browser and refresh. And we're not going to see a whole lot just yet, except that we're going to see that the rest of that text disappears. So we know that the home page, the very first section here, looks exactly like we need it to look. And if we were to scroll now, we see the text and the Earth image scroll up fine, which is good. And eventually we'll scroll all the way down to the next piece of text. And we'll scroll further down to get to the next piece of text. And we're not seeing the images yet, because remember, those images are fixed. So they're not affected by scrolling at all. That's where we're going to have to pull in jQuery and make those things animate for us. But we'll go ahead and scroll all the way down till we see the planets section as well. And once everything looks good, we can jump into jQuery and start coding this thing and making it work. So that wraps it up for this video. In the next video, we'll get started actually making this parallax scrolling work with 3 different levels of scrolling. So we'll get to that in the next video. Thank you for watching.